In order to blend two or more exposures to create a high dynamic range image, you first need to capture two or more exposures in the camera. Knowing when and how to bracket exposures is important. Let's begin with when to bracket. Earlier, we discussed how to use the histogram to evaluate the dynamic range in a scene. We know that low contrast images like this one have all the tonal information bunched in the midtones, and they don't even utilize the dynamic range capability of a single exposure. Bracketing exposures here doesn't gain you anything. This scene has higher contrast, but it still all fits within a single exposure. I might choose to bracket this scene so I could avoid having to make big shadow recovery adjustments that could bring out noise, but technically it isn't necessary. We also saw that sometimes it may appear that bracketing will be required, but it turns out that we've just underexposed or overexposed the image. And the exposure value can actually be adjusted to record the entire dynamic range in a single exposure. When we see a histogram like this, with both the shadows and the highlights being clipped at the same time, the dynamic range of the camera is being exceeded and bracketing will be required. Now that we've identified when multiple exposures are necessary, how should we go about capturing them? While it's possible to blend exposures that don't line up exactly, having precise alignment is very helpful. When I know that I'm going to take multiple exposures, I make sure my tripod is very stable and I have tightened down the ball head. I turn off autofocus and focus manually to make sure that the camera doesn't refocus between exposures. I use either the manual or aperture priority camera settings and adjust the exposure value by changing only the shutter speed so the depth of field stays constant. In cases where I also need a specific shutter speed, I can opt to change exposure values by changing the ISO instead. Some people prefer to set their cameras to auto bracket and simply just shoot multiple exposures all the time. This shotgun type approach can work, but it often doesn't. If you set the camera to bracket 3 exposures, or 5, or even 7, some situations will require more exposures than that, but some will require fewer. It's essential to have enough exposures, and I prefer not to have too many if I can help it. Even if you get lucky and set the correct number of auto-bracketed exposures, those exposures won't necessarily align with the dynamic range of the scene. For example, in this situation, I set my camera to auto-bracket 5 exposures. The camera chose a starting exposure and then bracketed 2 stops up and 2 stops down. Unfortunately, that wasn't the right choice. I ended up with the darkest exposure still having highlights blown out in the sky and the lightest exposure brighter than I needed it. 5 exposures were enough. They just needed to be shifted 1 stop lower. We often only get one chance to capture good light. By the time I had compensated for the camera's mistake, the light had completely changed and I missed the shot. Unless I'm trying to very rapidly fire off shots to minimize motion of something like clouds, or unless I'm trying to bracket while hand holding the camera, I prefer to manually bracket my exposures. This ensures that I take the correct number and that they're properly aligned with the dynamic range of the scene. With the camera meter at the 0 exposure value, I take the first shot and evaluate the histogram. Then I compensate the exposure either up 1 stop or down 1 stop. In this case, up 1 stop. I take that shot and evaluate that histogram. I'm still clipping the shadows, so I compensate the exposure up another stop and take another shot. Now the histogram indicates I'm no longer clipping the shadows, so I won't need to make any large adjustments to the dark areas. Now I adjust the exposure value to -1 stop and take a shot. This histogram shows that the highlights are right on the edge, so to ensure that I capture accurate colors, I compensate 1 stop lower and take a final shot. Now I have one exposure that contains all the highlight information and one exposure that is properly exposed for the darkest areas, plus additional exposures at 1 stop increments in between. I have exactly as many exposures as I need, no more and no less. In this case, it was 5 exposures, but by the next image, it might have changed to require only 2 or maybe 7. It doesn't matter because using this approach, I always get the correct number of exposures and they're always centered properly around the dynamic range. Another bracketing method that I sometimes use is based on tonal zones and requires the use of live view and aperture priority in the camera. It's a little hard to describe, but here are the basics. In live view, with the meter set to a 0 exposure value, I move the live view exposure box, usually a small rectangular square, around to different tonal regions in the scene. As the box moves around the live view, the camera adjusts the exposure value on the fly. I take exposures in overlapping tonal zones throughout the scene, usually one or two parts of the sky, the transition from sky to land, and one or two places in the land. The resulting exposures will not necessarily be in one-stop increments, so this doesn't work well if you're using HDR software. But for blending in Photoshop, even exposure spacing isn't necessary. However you go about bracketing your exposures, the main objective is to get proper exposures for the entire dynamic range. Often, 2 exposures will be enough. Other times you may capture several exposures but only end up needing 2 of them. In some cases, all the exposures you take will be needed. Next up, we'll begin to look at how to blend.